Hello to Blogging Heads Nation. This is Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I blog at foreignpolicy.com. And I'm honored, nay humbled, to have this dialogue with Eli Lake, official muckraking reporter for the Washington Times. It's the first dialogue I've had with Eli. So, Eli, welcome aboard.
Thank you for doing this. And I've been reading you for years, and it's an honor for me too.
Likewise. In fact, if memory serves, you wrote about me once, actually.
When did I write about you?
I think when I got denied tenure at Chicago.
No, I don't think I wrote that story.
That wasn't you? It was the New York Sun. That's why
the New York Sun, I think, wrote the story.
Yeah.
I hope we did okay by you.
One can hope so.
Okay.
Anyway, we wanted to start off, I think, by talking about the current state of al-Qaeda.
Yes.
And you had some thoughts about I wrote a blog post earlier this week.
We should
go
link,
ahead.
we're going to link the blog post, and we should
Of
also,
course.
Why don't you describe your idea of behind the
Right.
music?
Well, let me preface this by
al-Qaeda.
saying we apologize if there is a slight lack of spontaneity in this dialogue. We actually did this 24 hours ago, and unfortunately it got eaten. So this will just mean it's really take two, and it'll be that much better and sharper. But I wrote a blog post earlier that was based on the latest issue of al-Qaeda's Inspire magazine, which basically was pleading with Americans sympathetic to al-Qaeda's cause to, really shake up the system by doing things like shooting people in popular D.C. eateries like Kosi's and Potbelly. There was a separate article, I believe, that advocated putting like lawnmower blades on the front of trucks and sort of driving down sidewalks. I guess in the worst sort of Chuck Norris movie that would exist to man. My reaction to this was that, this was a organization that, 10 years ago, it was responsible for, a series of high-profile attacks culminating with the 9/11 attacks. And, the sort of stuff they're talking about now, we're almost talking about a group that has followed VH1's Behind the Music arc, which, as anyone who's ever seen even a single snippet of this show knows, it would follow along the lines of, a young engineer from Saudi Arabia and a dentist or a surgeon from Egypt had combined to form a new terrorist supergroup. Their heights had never been equaled with the 9/11 attacks. But afterwards, fame caught up to them, and they couldn't quite deliver on their subsequent promise. And then, desperate attempts to somehow revive Old Glory, and slowly the group sort of fades away into insignificance. And so, my fear is my hope is that al-Qaeda is following this narrative. My fear is that they will not have the third act redemption that takes place in some of the behind the music narratives. But
stay tuned for the next episode of VH1 Storytellers with Ayman Zawahiri.
Yes.
Right.
VH1's Behind the Terror. My point is that they're now so low in the totem pole that they're like opening for the Mexican drug cartels or something. So they're just not as important as they used to be. But I think you wanted to take issue with this.
Well, I don't want to take issue with the idea of what you're pointing out, which is that in the late 90s and up to 2001, al-Qaeda planned and executed very complex, multi-target attacks that required their operatives to have more training, and that this is in contrast to not just what is recommended in Inspire magazine, but also Abdul Muttalib, the attempted Christmas Day bomber of the Northwest Airlines flight, who had
Captain Underpants, as I like to call him.
Underwear. Right?
I like calling him Captain Underpants myself.
Captain Underpants, right? Or the car bomb of Faisal Shahzad in Times Square, or for that matter, even the successful and tragic attempts of Nadal Hassan, the Army major psychiatrist who was radicalized in a relationship with Anwar al-Awlaki. So there is a difference there. My cautioning here. And I think we both are friends with Spencer Ackerman has made a lot out of al-Qaeda not what it used to be.
Right.
Is that if we were having this conversation a year and a half ago, and you said or I said al-Qaeda is capable of attacks in the United States, most of the intelligence community say actually that's wrong, and most analysts would say that's wrong, that al-Qaeda had not demonstrated that capability. Now we know they have what appears to have been multiple networks in the United States. We know that Najibullah Zazi had a network in people buying chemicals in Denver, Colorado, as well as New York, the New York City area. We know about the lone gunman attempts like Nadal Hassan and Faisal Shahzad, but a guy named David Headley, who was in contact with one of the senior al-Qaeda commanders, a guy named Ilyas Kashmiri, was a major planner of the Mumbai attacks and was asked to carry out attacks from his base in Chicago in Copenhagen in the newspaper that published the Muhammad cartoons, Jyllands Posten. So the difference now, I think one cause for alarm is that al-Qaeda has some capability to attack the United States. And that was something that we did not think they had a year and a half, 2 years ago.
Right. Now, I think the question then becomes at that point, I think that's a fair counterpoint, but this raises two issues. The first is the extent to which al-Qaeda actually has control over these groups. In some ways, to continue the behind-the-music analogy, the Americans involved here are almost like the guys who get involved in tribute bands for whatever their great band is. And let's face it, if they're in a tribute band, they're probably not as good as the real thing. So one wonders that they can obviously try to communicate with these groups, but I wonder to what extent it's a one-way communication, and to what extent can they actually coordinate the actions of the Americans. In some ways, that's both the strength and the weakness. The strength is, since they're not engaged in that close a coordination, it becomes that much tougher for U.S. Homeland Security officials to detect them. The downside is because they can't, coordinate, they might wind up, either doing things ineptly or doing things that al-Qaeda had not initially asked for or what have you. And I think in some ways, I hope we agree on this, the call for this was, I think, particularly to be done prior to the midterms. It'll be interesting to see whether or not you see any attacks between now and the midterms as evidence to some extent of al-Qaeda's ability to motivate either sleeper cells or sympathizers in the United States. The second concern I have on this, and we talked about this before, is the question about civil liberties, which is, in some ways, I will consciously say something that, if I were actually running for office, I would get pilloried for saying, which is, if the trade-off for trying to crack down on these sort of domestic sympathizers is unlimited, power of the federal government to engage in surveillance of American citizens, through wiretaps and what have you. And if I'm willing, if that's one option and you manage to prevent, 99.9999% of these attacks, or by not doing that, by putting, some clear constitutional and legal safeguards on the ability of Homeland Security officials to detect this kind of thing, you allow that one COSI is going to get shot up every quarter. I'll take the one COSI getting shot up every quarter. I'm not concerned on the civil liberties front. And the problem is, I think in some ways, Obama said this as well last month when he gave that interview about the sort of resilience of the United States in response to terrorist attacks. I guess I'd ask you, to what extent do you think that is a trade-off?
I want to get back to your civil liberties points because I think I largely agree with you there. But I would say the level of communications versus inspired loners and coordinated operatives varies. In the Headley case, the various documentation from that court case, which I've recently looked into, suggests that there was a bit of communication at a pretty senior level in Pakistan with this guy Ilyas Kashmiri and others, and that they were able to go to Pakistan and then come back. That's the other key thing, is Headley and another Canadian American were able to go and then come back. And I would also just point out that Mumbai-style sort of paramilitary kind of commando attacks, more sophisticated than an IED or a truck bomb, less sophisticated than 9/11, pretty terrifying prospect. And I think that was behind the concern that this was the style of attack was behind the recent terrorism warnings for Europe. That, at least in the intelligence community, people were freaked out about it.
I'll agree. The warning about Europe had that echo. I was working for the federal government in the Treasury Department in the summer of 2001. And I remember it had that feel of it, which is they knew that, by that point the government knew something was going on. They just didn't know exactly what. And in some ways, it's encouraging that the intelligence might have been a little more specific in detail. But in some ways, this also gives rise to a larger concern I have about debates about, the sort of policy trade-offs we have in terms of dealing with al-Qaeda and sympathizers, which is, you never get really all that penalized for taking a maximalist position saying we must stop terror no matter what. All it takes is for some, to cite some intelligence official saying, we have serious, the al-Qaeda remains a threat. And I don't think, I'm not going to dispute that al-Qaeda remains a threat, but I don't think you get any political any political boost by saying, yeah, they're a threat, but they're not as serious a threat as they used to be. That even if there's a greater likelihood that an attack takes place on U.S. soil, the actual magnitude of that attack is not as serious as, let's say, typical gang-on-gang drug violence or what have you.
This is a point that Philip Mudd, who just left the FBI and a longtime CIA guy, is making in public statements. He's in something which I recommend BHTV viewers read. Is the West Point has something called the Counterterrorism Sentinel. It's sort of a technical, but you've got a lot of really expert people inside and outside the government writing just about al-Qaeda and Islamic radical groups. And
right.
he had a very interesting piece in, I think, the September issue of the Sentinel on this very point.
And I guess the problem is that the political optics of having this debate are tricky because there's been enough. We know that in the past, politicians who have suggested who have put up the idea of we have to treat terrorism as one of a series of problems that won't necessarily completely go away, but is manageable. I'm thinking John Kerry in 2004,
right.
But other officials as well. Who have caught political flack for saying this. Even though I think there's a very large grain of truth, or at least it's a defensible position, and it's a position I would like to see articulated more in public policy debates.
Well, let me put a finer point on your civil liberties question, because I think that you're asking the right question, and it's good to see. And I would agree with you. I think that we have to accept some risk, But here's the tough one.
Yeah.
The government has the capability to track everybody who visits a jihadist web forum. Now, if you're spending a lot of time in a jihadist web forum, that's actually, now we know, there's actually been case studies. A guy named Evan Coleman did what I thought was a kind of path-breaking analysis of from the beginning of the radicalization process on the internet of a Moroccan to his final martyrdom notice in Iraq. So that's an example of somebody who goes on the internet, gets radicalized, and is motivated to become a suicide bomber in Baghdad. Okay. There's no particular reason why that process could not end up in Los Angeles or Washington, D.C.
Right.
So jihadist web forums are a pretty good indicator that people who are kind of just saying that, this sort of spending time there, getting involved in it, getting these kinds of conversations, that is a protected First Amendment issue for an American citizen. It's also it's also a leading indicator of that you're going to become radicalized. So is it okay then for the government to track the people who visit these web forums, and they change like every few months too, so you got to go to different sites. It's not always a cut and dry process, and then follow them, because they also have this ability, wherever else they go on the internet. Because when I talk to professionals, what they tell me is that, if they can do that, they can find, they can probably find people, a lot of people who they fear would be kind of homegrown, radicalized, the hardest kinds to track. But it would be, it would set a nightmarish kind of precedent if there was a government agency that was literally going to only track you based on the fact that you visited a website.
Well,
how does that, and what if that precedent then turns into, anarchist websites, or, I don't know, moveon.org. You know what I'm saying? And then you really do have thought crimes.
The NRA.
That's what I'm saying, though, is that, and that strikes me as, I don't have an answer. I'm just posing the kind of problem.
Well, first of all, this isn't a First Amendment issue. I'd assume this is a Fourth Amendment issue.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It's a Fourth Amendment issue, but it's also a right to assemble, I guess, digitally.
Oh, I see. That's a fair point. Yeah, that's an interesting twist on it. And the answer, that is let me put it this way. I think that's a debate worth having. My take on this actually is, in some ways, what I will never completely forgive the Bush administration for. And in their defense, had the shock of 9/11 and then the question of what do we do now?
Right.
And their response was a series of sort of ad hoc steps to empower the federal government to do things that, previously the government had not had the power to do. But they never properly institutionalized it. Or when they did try to institutionalize it, it rested upon a legal foundation that was so shaky that, later conservatives that appointed by the Bush administration said, you can't do this. So in some ways...
But then it settled into basically a legal foundation that Obama accepts. The September 14th resolution after 9/11 declaring effectively war on the people responsible for 9/11 gives the government the authority to surveil, track, detain, and kill anyone all over the world who might be responsible or connected to al-Qaeda, the organization responsible for 9/11.
Right. I mean, and I think my suggestion on this is actually one of the few areas where I really do think a presidential commission is actually appropriate, in the sense that it would be worth having, a high-level panel try to put forward and articulate a legal framework for how we deal with this problem, which, let's face it, the U.S. can pull out of Afghanistan, it can pull out of Iraq. This problem is not going to go away. It is here to stay in the sense of, simply put, the barriers, to entry for terrorist groups to make life difficult for, the civilized world they've been lowered dramatically. So it's not al-Qaeda, it's going to be another group out there.
Right.
And so it seems to me appropriate to ask what kind of legal framework can we have, that doesn't, because this situation doesn't fit the Geneva Conventions. It doesn't, fit neatly into the U.S. criminal justice system either necessarily. So I agree with Jack Goldsmith that it is worth, considering whether or not a parallel, a separate independent legal structure needs to be set up. But to do that, and to do it properly, you have to do it in such a way that you get buy-in, both from the American people and from the authoritative branches of government. So one of the useful things a presidential commission can occasionally do is actually set the agenda on this.
Well, let me press you on one thing.
Okay.
You said it, and by the way, not just you, Harold Koh, the legal general counsel for the State Department, has said this as well.
Yeah.
That the Geneva Conventions don't quite really apply to this kind of war.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not trying to score a partisan point, though I do think it's relevant for your idea, which I agree with about the commission, a bipartisan commission, which is that if that's the case, if that there needs to be a recognition, then the arguments in 2007, 2008 that I would associate with many progressives that Doug Feith is in violation of international law, therefore he should go to The Hague, or is a war criminal, or we need a truth and reconciliation process, which is what Soros has said, George Soros has said, and others have echoed. It renders, I think, that argument, I think that you have to kind of go back and you say, wait a second, it really isn't quite analogous to the Geneva Conventions. We really do have an inadequacy of international law. It is really difficult to fight an enemy that doesn't wear a uniform that could be anywhere all over the world, and so forth and so on, right?
I mean, I would accept that with, to certain limits, in the sense that, I mean, there were, even if the Geneva Convention is not a perfect template for, the sort of conflict we're involved in, the Geneva Convention nevertheless does restrain states from certain activities, regardless of the kind of combat they're engaged in. So, when we talk about the John Yoo memos, for example, that clearly crossed a line, regardless of what you think of al-Qaeda, that, successive scholars said, no, that's a really inappropriate legal framework. But on the other hand, on issues about, and as you mentioned, the Obama administration has actually wound up embracing, or at least accepting, a large part of the sort of abrogated the powers given to the executive branch by the 9/14 presidency, which does suggest, I agree with you, in fact, that that the Bush administration is hardly the only culprit here. And I think in some ways that's why I'm actually moderately optimistic that a commission would actually be useful here, because the thing that's always struck me whenever I go to panels that talk about this stuff is not so much the difference between, let's say, someone like John Yoo or someone like Nadine Strawson, who's the head of the ACLU. It's not their differences, it's actually the similarities, the acknowledgments that these are really tough questions. And in fact, that there's going to be disagreements, but we're wrestling with clear gaps in the law that need to be addressed somehow.
I think that's right. The serious legal people agree generally on the problem and the contours. I think that Yu is wrong when he asserts that the inherent wartime authorities of the executive give essentially the president to overrule laws passed by Congress.
No, that's just horseshit.
Right, that's overboard, and I don't agree with that. But you're right. I do think that there is at least an agreement on that. Can I just one more thing about torture, and I want to probe you on this.
Okay.
There's a lot that we can't know about issues of torture based on our partnerships with the Afghan National Army, the Inter-Service Intelligence of the Pakistani intelligence services, let alone the Egyptians and so forth, that we know that in our counterterrorism partnerships with these countries, they're probably the host nation is practicing a form of torture. And I like to pose this question about, 8 or 9 months ago. Good news, the Pakistani army captured Mullah Barater, who is the sort of chief commander of the Afghan Taliban, and U.S. has not gotten access to him. And my question is, do you think that he's not being tortured? And if he is being tortured, do you think that the U.S. is not getting any of that information? And so, how much cleaner morally are we if we're relying or we're partnering with countries that are practicing torture, probably worse forms of torture, than a limited secret program run by the CIA that waterboards and does sleep deprivation? And I'm not necessarily saying all that's okay. I'm just saying that I wonder if it's so either or.
I don't know. I mean, and just to expand this a little bit, you can argue that the key difference between the Obama administration's, execution of the war on terror and the Bush administration's is that the Obama administration, they've clearly, obviously, disdained the torture element. On the other hand, they're perfectly keen on the assassination targeted drone strikes attitude about this. So it's not. These are obviously thorny questions. My hunch is that this is one of those, in terms of partnering with governments that engage in extremely unsavory practices. The realist in me says this is a part of, foreign policy that is odious but also, unfortunately, unavoidable. It's not like. I think the real question in terms of culpability comes from what happens if the U.S. captures someone and then decides to hand them over to one of these intelligence agencies, knowing what's going to happen to them because they themselves won't do it. Then that becomes really a problem because obviously U.S. culpability plays a role there.
When I was in Iraq in 2007, I got a chance to observe an interrogation through a U.S. MIT team, kind of training an Iraqi military unit. And I did not see torture practiced. What I did see, however, was very clearly the threat made in a very calm voice: if you don't cooperate with us, we will send you to an institution of the Iraqi government that will make your life very unpleasant. And it wasn't even specific. It wasn't like they're going to do this and that to you. It was just like, we know we can send you to a place that won't treat you so nicely. And everybody, and by the way, the person who was being questioned knew exactly what that meant and started literally, crying and praying to Allah. It was a very emotional moment. I'm not saying, I think that there is a real downside to the U.S. approving a regime of enhanced interrogation or torture light, or call it torture, okay? We can't be a moral exemplar. It's against international law that we believe in. There's a series of problems with it, and it's also immoral. But it's also, I just don't think that I don't think the Obama administration got us out of the woods because they signed an executive order saying they were going to shut down the CIA enhanced interrogation program.
Right. No. I mean, no, and I don't disagree with that. I think the U.S. is so long as it's engaged in these kinds of operations, so long as it maintains the alliances you're talking about, it's imbricated in these questions, and it's inescapable. And the answer is, I'm not sure there is a completely clean path.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
Going forward. I mean, as much as you want to talk about it, I mean, you're right. All administrations have their hands dirty on this. I'm not sure there is an ideal way of doing it. As you said, if I were a U.S. interrogator, of course I use the threat of handing this guy over to a group of even greater unsavories. I mean, I've watched NYPD Blue. I've watched police interrogation movies. I know how this works. At least in the police interrogation movies, whether it actually works that way is, although your eyewitnessing suggests that it does work that way. But you're right. I think we can, unfortunately,
Well, this guy actually, this is the thing. I mean, this is the reason why torture is so awful and odious. Yeah. He was innocent. It was a totally politicized, and at the end of the day, this is cleared up because, this was, I mean, to give you a sense of how screwy Iraq is and was in 2007, the tip for the arrest of this individual came from a member of the Iraqi parliament to the Iraqi commander of the area on his cell phone. I mean, that. Okay. Anyway, as you can imagine, there's 1,000 problems with that.
Right, I mean, and as you point out, in some ways, that's the real reason why. Right. One of the reasons I hate this debate in the United States is it's always predicated on, but the guy is guilty, therefore we need to do anything possible to get this information because there could be a ticking time bomb. Except, of course, the reason you have these safeguards, beyond just the sheer morality of not, torturing another human being, is what if the person is innocent? What if the person is caught up, is picked up for the wrong reason? So,
well, I would go one further. I think it's generally pretty desirable. We're a little bit off topic, but I think this is relevant. It's generally very desirable to follow this, for lack of a better word, an awakening-like strategy or counter-coin strategy, where we train up locals who are the enemies of al-Qaeda and, for that matter, Iranian-backed groups, and they do the fighting. But if that's what, and I think that's much better. I think we don't. There's a million reasons why I think that's a better strategy. Most importantly, because the U.S. military doesn't have to be in strange climates where they're seen as an occupying power. So right. If that's the plan to do it, I think you almost have to accept a certain degree of brutality and torture, because the local awakenings that you find in Afghanistan and and in Anbar are going to have very different standards for how they treat captives than we do. And you may train them, and maybe you'll humanize them, maybe you'll make them better. But
and I think that is the best policy response on this, which is you if you're going to engage in these kinds of partnerships, you stress the role of human rights, and even if it winds up being almost a Potemkin kind of exercise where they're like, yeah, human rights are sure, giggle, snort, right. You still do it because it's better than not doing it. And
by the way, one area where I think it sort of worked was in Colombia in the 1990s. Very much Plan Colombia opposed by the left, and the Colombian military pretty unsavory. But I think that the Colombian military is better, and they won the insurgency. They beat the FARC, which was the ultimate policy outcome.
Yeah. Okay.
So
moving on from now I'm upset because I had a great segue yesterday.
Oh, I know.
It was seamless and effortless, but
from FARC to Islam.
Right. But speaking of Islam, one of the questions that's brewing is, are you seeing an upsurge in American sympathizers, to al-Qaeda, in no small part because of, for lack of a better way of putting it, the truly kooky or, extreme views of the American right that somehow Sharia is threatening the U.S. Constitution as we know it, and or we should burn the Quran and various other, extreme acts.
Yes. I have been reading some of the original documents going back to the Holy Land Foundation trial and trying to kind of understand some of let arguments here.
The arguments made by Frank Gaffney and others.
Well, and Pamela Geller. Right. And let me start by first saying the following. If the extent to which you want to say that the Council on American Islamic Relations or other groups that are affiliated with the International Muslim Brotherhood are not, as they claim to be, Muslim civil rights organizations, but really are interested in Islamizing or shaping the American Muslim community, then I think that that's true. And I think that particularly in the case of CARE, which is not transparent about a lot of its funding, which, and you can find a 1991 memo that was I guess, sort of revealed in the Holy Land Foundation case, which lays out a path towards quote-unquote civilizational jihad, which is a term that you'll sort of see in this element of the right-wing literature on this.
Right.
And so insofar as there are a small number, there are groups of people, we can name them, of who they are, whose agenda is to Islamize the American Muslim community and then even Islamize America, that's what they want to do. I think that's true. That is what they want to do. Here's where I lose them, Dan. If you think that that's something that is any chance of ever happening and therefore should be a national security priority, or should there be something that we talk about at the national level, that's where I think it's bonkers. Which is to say, if you want to say these groups want to do this, and I don't like it, go ahead, fine. But if you say this is really like a major threat to our way of life, that's just nonsense.
No, I don't disagree. I mean, I've been reluctant to talk about this in the sense that I had a dialogue with Heather Hurlburt during the summer when the Park 51 thing was at its peak, where I basically said is that I think the argument is idiotic. I think it rests on a kernel of literally the phrase "clash of civilizations" from Sam Huntington's famous argument back in the 90s. Except of course Huntington argued in the end that even if you believe in the clash of civilizations, the best policy response was a live or let live approach, wherein you respected and tolerated other civilizations. Whereas clearly these people believe that it's a zero-sum game and we must defend American borders from Islam at all costs, because even just the tiniest Islamization is clearly a threat to the U.S. Constitution. That said, I always get uncomfortable with the arguments made by, let's say, David Petraeus, who actually explicitly said this, and I thought was way out of line in saying this, that these debates about either Park 51 or the burning of the mosque by the jackasses in Florida represented a threat to national security. And the reason I don't like that is twofold. First, I have a memory of when we were having debates about what to do in Afghanistan and then later what to do in Iraq in the early part of last decade, where people in the Bush administration and their supporters denounced critics of existing U.S. policies by saying, by criticizing U.S. foreign policy, you're weakening U.S. national security. And so I don't like the stifling of debate, even if the debate is truly asinine. I guess I'm a million absolutist when it comes to this. I particularly don't like officials of the state saying, don't talk about this,
I was
because
with that too. I know what you're saying.
It'll undercut national security.
If I may, though, in Petraeus' defense, I think, to strengthen your argument first, every year the Taliban invents some pretext to, protest the Americans and cause riots. I mean, every year. Remember, there was a story, which I think actually was true, even though it was denied eventually by Michael Isikoff in Newsweek, about flushing the Quran down the toilet. Remember this? It was a small Periscope item in Newsweek, back when people used to read Newsweek in the print version. Anyway, and they found this one item, and they turned it into this huge deal. And the White House, for 2 weeks after this thing ran, didn't say anything, because it was, frankly, I think it was probably true. But then they were like, it's the worst form of journalism, and they attacked the journalist, and I don't like that sort of thing, being a journalist. So I guess, so in that respect, I'm going to strengthen the argument. I think in Petraeus' sense, because I did talk to some people around him, I said, well, what was this all about? He's like, listen, people were going to get killed if he did this thing. I was really, I'm all over, it was in Afghanistan in particular, it was a huge issue, and sometimes you can't always make, what would be the kind of perfect decision, and he sort of said, I think too many lives are at stake. And I think that he made the decision to go public like that after someone had been killed in a riot that was sort of attributed to this concern about Captain Kangaroo burning the Qurans and so forth. I understand Petraeus is in a very difficult position, and telling national security officials don't talk about this is, of course, obviously not easy for them to do. But that said, well, he wanted to talk about it to say to the Afghan media primarily, this is not the policy of the United States.
That would be fair to say, I think.
Right, okay.
but that's not the only thing that he said, if memory serves.
Yeah, he also said, "Don't do it," and then
right, and that I think crosses a line. First of all, because there is no such thing as talking only to local media at this point. If you talk to local media, it eventually becomes global. And second is that again, if you allow the enemy to define what is acceptable and unacceptable,
Agreed.
Agreed.
But then this gets to the other thing. Why is it that there seems to be an emerging market, at least in political commentary, for creeping Sharia pending Islamization of the United States? Well, one answer is there's a guy who's the president, who's the first black president, and his middle name is Hussein, and he gave a speech in Cairo saying this is where the Quran is revealed. So maybe some of this is a reaction to Obama being the other. I accept maybe some of that's going on. But I think the other thing is this. President Bush and President Obama, in, I think, a very noble attempt to say, listen, the vast majority of Islam are not radicals. This is, that sort of went out of their way to leave the impression that Islam was just like Judaism and just like Christianity, when in certain respects, Dan, and I don't mean this in a way to paint with too broad a stroke, Islam is not in the same place historically as Christianity and Judaism is right now. It's not yet had what many scholars of Islam say is they need is a reformation of sorts. And there are more people who believe a kind of fanaticism in Islam, it appears, than there are people who would kind of have similar beliefs in Judaism or Christianity. And that's not to say that there aren't plenty of moderate Muslims. It's just to say that Islam, in some ways, is a little different. Is that fair?
I'm not so sure. I mean, I would say two things. The first is to back up your first point. I mean, this is not just about Obama. It's also about the fact that George W. Bush is no longer president. Okay. And I think if nothing else, what's happened over the last 6 months has actually caused American progressives perhaps to appreciate that one of the virtues of George W. Bush was that in fact he basically did not allow conservatives to make this kind of talk.
Right.
And that might be one of his greatest achievements, I would argue, as president. As a post-9/11 president, which is you did not see, by and large, this kind of religious baiting of Islam, which would have been a very easy thing, based on how America's responded to past attacks. That could have easily happened. So in some sense, I agree that the Bush administration deserves credit for that. On the question of Islam as a state religion, let me preface this by saying I'm not a religious scholar, so I'm wading into unfamiliar waters. I'm not entirely sure I buy your argument in the sense of, first of all, you can argue there have been waves of Jewish and Christian fundamentalism as well that have also triggered, and these groups also have very millennial views about the state of world politics and the coming apocalypse, however you want to put it. Their violence might get expressed in slightly different ways, but I'm not sure that it's all, that sort of, great awakening is all that different from what's going on within Islam. The second is that I think part of the problem is, let's face it, the majority of... I think one of the problems here is the conflation between Islam and Arab Islam, for lack of a better way of putting it, because you can argue that Islam, as it exists in a whole variety of states, is somewhat moderate, has certainly come to grips with the modern world, as we can put it. But there are states, there are places that are predominantly Muslim that have fallen behind in terms of things like global economic development, and this has triggered certain kind of religious responses, which are extremely unfortunate. I agree.
Let me just make what I think is a key distinction. Mm-hmm. There are Jewish fanatics who live in the West Bank in the center of Hebron, who say, who I would call Judeo-fascists. Okay.
Yeah.
And these people are not in any way representative of any kind of mainstream Judaism or mainstream Israeli politics. The Jewish fanatics in Hebron, while they do exercise influence, clearly as we're seeing now in the peace process, are not represented by the government. In no way can you say that the really extreme millennial worldview is represented by Benjamin Netanyahu or any of the kind of Israeli leaders.
What about Avigdor Lieberman? Just to push back.
Well, Avigdor Lieberman. I mean, I'm not defending his loyalty oath or anything like that, but he's actually coming from a very different place. He's not really a Jewish fundamentalist as much as he is a kind of post-peace process. All right, let's just draw a line. And he has some pretty disturbing recommendations, but he's not. That doesn't really. His political base is not Orthodox Jews, and he doesn't.
He would be Dick Cheney rather than Glenn Beck. To
Sort of, I guess you could say. And then let's look at this country. Like we have crazy this Captain Kangaroo guy in Florida who wants to burn the Qurans. There are certainly people, and I'm not saying that they don't exist. I'm just saying that the corpus, the mainstream of American Christianity and Western Christianity very much rejects this asceticism. I think that there are a lot of institutions in the Islamic world that also reject radical Islam. So I'm not denying that. What I'm saying is there also are very powerful institutions that are promoting it and funding it. And there are states like Iran, although it's Shia, which is supporting it. So, and then there are groups like Hezbollah, which is also Shia. But so what I'm saying is that there is more, there are greater numbers, and that there's just more money and more behind this more extreme form of Islam.
No, and that gets to, Huntington talked about Islam's bloody borders, and I think that's
right.
There's a truth there that at least, has to be acknowledged, and, maybe you can explain it away for a variety of reasons, but I think, to entirely dismiss the religious angle perhaps would be,
right.
It would not be sufficiently objective.
See, my view is that, I think that both Obama and Bush recognized that there was a fight within Islam, but sometimes it came off to the American public like they were excusing something that a less discerning viewer or reader would simply say is, well, that's just the Muslims are crazy. And so...
Well, and this gets back, we talked about this before, this gets back to the way in which politicians tend to be
Right.
Politicians tend to be lumpers, and policymakers tend to be splitters.
Right.
If you're a politician or you're a rabble-rouser, you want to lump all your enemies into one single, undifferentiated adversary. Whereas if you're a policymaker, you obviously have a vested interest in trying to figure out if there are internal divisions in, the groups that potentially don't want to oppose you, and potentially exploiting those divisions or fissures as a way to advance American interests.
Right.
And so in some ways I tend to be a splitter, but as a splitter, I know that the political discourse tends to favor lumpers, unfortunately.
And I just would say one more thing that is confusing this whole thing is that the group, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is maybe the first instantiation of modern political Islam, is very complicated exactly what it is in the Egyptian context. They're a force for counterterrorism. They help inform on more radical groups like Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and we know from Said ibn Ibrahim's work they help de-radicalize people in the Egyptian prison system, and that's to the benefit of the United States and the West. In the Muslim Brotherhood of Gaza is Hamas. They're a bunch of terrorists, and they are against the peace process, and they're probably, an enemy of the West. They are an enemy of the West in my estimation, and certainly an enemy of Israel. Muslim Brotherhood in Iraq is the party of Iraq's vice president, Tariq al-Hashemi. Muslim Brotherhood in Syria was a group that was probably engaged in terrorism, and, you can go on and on. What Muslim Brotherhood represents in Europe is very different from what it means in the United States or North America. The notion that there is a single agenda for the Muslim Brotherhood is one that I would challenge, and there's a lot we don't know about how this organization is organized on an international level. That's not to say that I'm not alarmed in some ways by the 1991 memo from this Holy Land Foundation case, or that if you want to limit the criticism to an organization like CARE, I probably am going to agree, but it's just to say that the wider question is a little bit more complicated.
Okay, I think we want to talk about the new NSC advisor.
Yes.
And whether there's any change from the old NSC advisor.
Yes. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. Or, well, okay, this is a great jumping off point. You had I thought, a very good blog post about ideology and ideologues, and how it's very popular now in Washington to claim so-and-so is really great because they're not ideological. And you had a really good retort, and why don't you just sort of explain it to the viewers? I thought that was great.
Well, this is in response to, whenever you get the promotion of a new policy principal, there appears to be a rite of passage in D.C.
Right.
in which journalists like yourself or top-ranking bloggers must write articles and or blog posts praising the new person to high heaven at least as they first come in, as a, quote, breath of fresh air, and gee, isn't it great that they're completely not like their predecessor. We saw this with Pete Rouse displacing Rahm Emanuel, and now we see it with Tom Donilon replacing Jim Jones. I assume this is basically an exercise in kiss-assery in the hopes that, 3 months from now you get a really good story and you can actually then talk to the policy principals. I'm just looking for confirmation on that point, Eli.
Well, it's generally too, but if there are any aspiring journalists, if you've got stuff that's damaging to an official or a particular institution, and you really have it, like, what I'm saying, it's not just, you sort of have it, then they're going to deal with you. So the notion, if you make your whole career based on carrying the favor of people in power so they'll be nice to you, at the end of the day they won't respect you because they don't like the press anyway. You know what I mean? They just it's usually an obstacle from the perspective of very senior policymakers.
Oh yeah.
So it's a little bit of back and forth. I very much believe in the old Bob Novak doctrine of sources and targets, which is there are two kinds of people in Washington: sources and targets. Who are you?
No, I know. I whenever I think of Bob Novak, Joe Bob Briggs wrote a classic essay about 15 years ago where he reviewed like all the Washington D.C. talk shows. This is back when they were, even more important than they were now. And his description of Bob Novak was the only human in history to, when he filed his IRS tax form, occupation, he wrote obnoxious.
Right.
That's how I was thinking
but Novak got, he
but
had a stunning
that was
career
the way
in terms of scoops. And I totally disagree with Novak on Israel and any number of things. I'm not saying the guy was a great political philosopher. I'm saying
but he was an honest-to-God journalist.
Yeah.
You're right in the sense of he did not curry favor. He was a gumshoe guy. So no, in some ways you want your journalist to be that obnoxious.
Right, and there is something to be said for a little bit of distance, right? We're a little bit off topic here, but you kind of raised it. I went to the Atlantic Ideas Festival this year in Aspen, Colorado. Which is,
I was not invited to the Aspen Ideas.
Well, anyway, it was really cool. Okay, it was great.
Okay.
I think any smart person who likes to read would have loved the access to not just cultural figures, but also a lot of government officials. But then there was an element there where I'm like, is this a little bit too chummy? Should I? I don't know. Like, at a certain point, it's inevitable if you stay in Washington long enough. Some of your friends are going to be in government, and that's just how it is, and you kind of make accommodations. It's not a perfect rule, but it's probably good to have a little bit of distance.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway.
No, I don't disagree with that. Anyway, so, Steve Clemens wrote a sort of typical blog post where he said all of these things about Donilon and about how the guy was a non-ideological pragmatist, and this sort of set something off within me, which is, and I say this as an academic IR person, it always galls me when I deal with policymakers, and I deal with them on a semi-regular point where, I'm told, oh, you academics with your, incredibly abstract theories, we in the real world, don't do that. And my response is, yes, you do. You just do it poorly.
Well, remember the one you had, the little, I don't want to say minor spat you had with Andrew McDonald Exum on this point of...
Oh, yes.
Right. Like, well, I'm just on the ground getting the facts.
No. This is where it's the same kind of thing where, policymakers do have theories. They just don't call them theories. They just, will use historical analogies or more abstract metaphors as a way of trying to get a grip on what is a really complex policy problem. I actually do have sympathy with policymakers trying to deal with something like Israel and Palestine or Iran or North Korea. There's a reason why these problems have persisted for decades, because they're really hard to solve. But the notion that somehow you don't have, that you're a pragmatist only and that you only have a just the facts ma'am approach, you're still going to have an internal cognitive framework that tells you which facts you think are really important and which facts aren't so important, and that's called ideology or theory.
Okay, can I have thought about this in the last 24 hours since we last talked about it?
Sure.
Let me just make a slight counter.
Okay.
Don't you think that there are certain facts which would more dictate the U.S. response to Iran and its nuclear program than the ideological assumptions of the people in the room? Like, for example, if you could verifiably know that Iran had compiled 20% or better if Iran was making highly enriched uranium and you knew it either at a secret facility or at Natanz, the one you were monitoring, and they had enough, like at a certain point, wouldn't that force a decision regardless of whether you were a hawk? And at the same time, you had a lot of people who ideologically disagreed with people in the Obama administration, the Bush administration, who wanted to not kick the can down the road in Iran, but ended up doing just that because
kicking the can because they saw there were no good policy options.
Right. So I'm saying sometimes, despite the ideology of the people making the decisions, just certain events force a reaction in some ways.
Well, I mean, yeah, you're correct in that even if you take a look at different theories, the academic way of putting this is sometimes if the parameter values are a certain thing, then obviously all all policy predictions wind up coming to the same outcome. So yes, there are certain facts that become so big that you cannot ignore them. So in that sense, it's true. I think the way I would distinguish pragmatists, I guess let me put it this way: when talking about pragmatists versus ideologues, I think there is a distinction, but it's not the distinction that Clemens and others talk about. In normal discourse. The distinction is between people who are intellectually honest and have theories that they know are falsifiable versus ideologues who are so convinced about their, way of seeing the world that they have the capacity to take any new fact and integrate it into that pre-existing framework as, further evidence that their framework is correct. So ideologies are non-falsifiable. Theories are falsifiable, I guess would be the way to put it. So a good intellectually honest policymaker, on either side of the aisle, will have a certain set of facts that if these things start to happen, as you say, we've clearly got to pursue this policy option. I was wrong in my earlier assumptions. We've got to change course.
And let me just add to that. Aren't there certain policy options, no matter how ideological you are, that just if you get to be a decision maker or policy maker in the U.S. government, are just not available to you. Like, you can be the most Flint Leverettist, Iran lover in the world, right? But if Flint Leverett is sitting on the National Security Council, he can't go to the meeting and say, okay, we'll just end our support for Israel. Because there's just certain facts of how, of what it, where we are right now and, what we're doing. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Well, this is always the frustrating thing if you're a political scientist in terms of trying to explain why is the government doing what it's doing. And for example, to go back to what we were talking about in terms of the Bush administration in Iran, at the time, I remember there was a lot of chatter coming from the left side of the blogosphere in 2006 to 2008 saying the Bush administration had a secret plan to launch a big PR campaign to launch a war with Iran. And thankfully, only because us progressives, caught on to this, we stopped them from doing so. And, more stories have come out that basically suggested that, in fact, it was Bush himself who basically put the kibosh both on U.S., supporters of an attack on Iran, as well as Israeli supporter. Israel that clearly did want to launch this strike, and basically the Bush administration said, "You're not going to do this."
He called Crystal the Bomber Boy or something.
Yeah. He had a typical Bushian nickname for it.
Right.
The Bomber Boys. I think that's what it was. Maybe those stories are plants as well. This is always the problem with trying to figure out what's actually happening. But sometimes you're right. Sometimes it's that someone really wants to pursue an out-of-the-box policy. They just can't do it because every other policy principal in the room thinks they're nuts. Or it might be that they think they want to do this policy. They get new information once they're in government. And they realize, oh, crap, we can't do this.
Well, I would just say two things. One, the U.S. system, which I know best, has a lot of just checks in it that make it very difficult to reverse longstanding policies.
Yes.
So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that usually the ideology of a given president or an administration will come out in these speeches and public rhetoric and deliberate documents which sort of frame the way they see the world. But then the actual decisions, who would have known? Kennedy ran for office in 1960, talking about the missile gap as a really tough guy. He's faced with a Cuban Missile Crisis, and he ignores the advice of his hawkish military advisors, right? So there's an example of every indication was that John F. Kennedy would have said no way and started World War III because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And yet, for some reason, he decides, I'm going to listen to O'Brien. I think we could figure out a way over this. And, crisis was diffused.
Or even George W. Bush, who,
Right.
during the campaign talked about modesty and
Sure.
he evinced a very realpolitik view of foreign policy, said we don't want to engage in nation building, things like that. And then post 9/11 obviously had a somewhat significant change of heart. I mean, part of this is just, as you said, big facts on the ground can change, even,
Right.
any sort of foreign policymaker's worldview. And there's evidence that this sort of thing happens all the time. But the point is that all policymakers do have worldviews, and guiding theories. And so the notion that someone can be a complete non-ideologue,
Right.
I find it's just not true. It's just that in some ways the worst kind of policymaker is someone who does have these theories. They just are in denial about whether or not they're in denial about what their overriding assumptions are. A good policymaker, regardless of what they're advocating, at least acknowledges to themselves what are their operating assumptions about how the world works in terms of why they're recommending what they do. And that's always been my experience.
Oh, this was great, man. I would like to do it again. A corollary to your point, I'll just end it on this, is
Yep.
that we have a love affair in policy circles with the idea of moderates. Moderation is a sort of idea of temperance and, not avoiding excess in your personal habits, sure. But, I don't know. I mean, we sort of got into this whole thing is that we define the world in the Islamic world as moderates and extremists. And I don't know. I always thought I would like liberal extremists or extremists against the extremism. Does that make
Right.
any sense?
Yes.
It's like the same kind of thing. It's like, you should have certain issues that you're not a moderate on, or else we won't ever have a debate. And just praising the idea, or bipartisanship. It's another one of these things. Like, I remember everybody, all these politicians always, when they retire, they always, want to do a Viagra commercial, with Dole and Clinton or something like that. And it's always this, that's the virtue in and of itself. When I think that at least intelligent debate and intelligent partisanship is a very good thing for democracy.
No, I don't disagree with that. I would say that part of the problem is that you naturally think of moderates. I think there's a tendency to. Part of it is the current times we're living in, where, let's face it, moderates have not necessarily had all that good of a run the last few years. It's been much more popular to be an extremist of one kind or another. The problem, of course, is that this tends to lead to, at least to things like Tom Friedman writing dumbass op-eds calling for a third party of moderates, when in fact it was very clear that whatever Friedman was espousing would attract, I believe, 10 other people in the United States, and that it wouldn't actually generate a large political groundswell. So it's always easy to disdain the political extremes, but in terms of what kind of moderate policy you're going to pursue, it's remarkable how once there can be unanimity within the Beltway about calling for more moderation and empowering the moderates. Then that breaks down when we actually try to say, well, what do we mean by moderates? What do they actually espouse? And I agree with you. There are certain values or certain policies where I don't want a moderate. I want someone who's a hardcore, defender of the First Amendment, or a hardcore, defender of civil liberties. So.
Or at least, and sometimes I feel like for an issue that I'm not really educated about, I want to hear both sides argued passionately.
Right, exactly.
Right.
So in that sense, I agree with you.
Right.
Well, this was a lot of fun.
It was really good. So I think it's not going to explode. Let me just stop it here.
Okay. Take care, Eli. Inspire magazine, which basically was pleading with Americans sympathetic to al-Qaeda's cause to, really shake up the system by doing things like shooting people in popular D.C. eateries like Kosi's and Potbelly. There was a separate article, I believe, that advocated putting lawnmower blades on the front of trucks and sort of driving down sidewalks. I guess in the worst sort of Chuck Norris movie that would exist to man. My reaction to this was that this was a organization that 10 years ago it was responsible for a series of high-profile attacks, culminating with the 9/11 attacks. And the sort of stuff they're talking about now, we're almost talking about a group that has followed VH1's Behind the Music arc, which, as anyone who's ever seen even a single snippet of this show knows, it would follow on the lines of, a young engineer from Saudi Arabia and a dentist or a surgeon from Egypt had combined to form a new terrorist supergroup. Their heights had never been equaled with the 9/11 attacks, but afterwards, fame caught up to them, and they couldn't quite deliver on their subsequent promise. And then, desperate attempts to somehow revive Old Glory, and slowly the group sort of fades away into insignificance. And so,
had attacks from his base in Chicago in Copenhagen in the newspaper that published the Muhammad cartoons, Gillen's posted. So the difference now, I think one cause for alarm is that al-Qaeda has some capability to attack the United States. And that was something that we did not think they had a year and a half, 2 years ago.
Right. Now, I think the question then becomes at that point, I think that's a fair counterpoint, but this raises two issues. The first is the extent to which al-Qaeda actually has control over these groups. In some ways, to continue the behind-the-music analogy, the Americans involved here are almost like the guys who get involved in tribute bands for whatever their great band is. And let's face it, if they're in a tribute band, they're probably not as good as the real thing. So one wonders that they can obviously try to communicate with these groups, but I wonder to what extent it's a one-way communication, and to what extent can they actually coordinate the actions of the Americans. In some ways, that's both the strength and the weakness. The strength is, since they're not engaged in that close a coordination, it becomes that much tougher for U.S. Homeland Security officials to detect them. The downside is because they can't, coordinate, they might wind up, either doing things ineptly or doing things that al-Qaeda had not initially. Hello to Blogging Heads Nation. This is Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I blog at foreignpolicy.com. And I'm honored, nay humbled, to have this dialogue with Eli Lake, official muckraking reporter for the Washington Times. It's the first dialogue I've had with Eli. So, Eli, welcome aboard.
Thank you for doing this. And I've been reading you for years, and it's an honor for me, too.
Likewise. In fact, if memory serves, you wrote about me once, actually.
When did I write about you?
I think when I got denied tenure at Chicago.
No, I don't think I wrote that story.
That wasn't you? It was the New York Sun. That's why
the New York Sun, I think, wrote the story.
Yeah.
I hope we did okay by you.
One can hope so.
Okay.
Anyway, we wanted to start off, I think, by talking about the current state of al-Qaeda.
Yes.
And you had some thoughts about I wrote a blog post earlier this week.
We should
go ahead.
We're going to link the blog post, and we should
Yes, of course.
why don't you describe your idea of behind the music?
Well, let me preface this by saying we apologize if there is a slight lack of spontaneity in this dialogue. We actually did this 24 hours ago, and unfortunately it got eaten. So this will just mean it's really take two, and it'll be that much better and sharper. But I wrote a blog post earlier that was based on the latest issue of al-Qaeda's. My fear is my hope is that al-Qaeda is following this narrative. My fear is that they will not have the third act redemption that takes place in some of the behind the music narratives. But
stay tuned for the next episode of VH1 Storytellers with Ayman Zawahiri.
Yes. VH1's Behind the Terror. My point is that they're now so low in the totem pole that they're like opening for the Mexican drug cartels or something. So they're just not as important as they used to be. But I think you wanted to take issue with this.
Well, I don't want to take issue with the idea of what you're pointing out, which is that in the late 90s and up to 2001, al-Qaeda planned and executed very complex, multi-target attacks that required their operatives to have more training, and that this is in contrast to not just what is recommended in Inspire magazine, but also Abdul Muttalib, the attempted Christmas Day bomber of the Northwest Airlines flight, who had
Captain Underpants, as I like to call him.
Underwear. Right?
I like calling him Captain Underpants myself.
Captain Underpants, right? Or the car bomb of Faisal Shahzad in Times Square, or for that matter, even the successful and tragic attempts of Nadal Hassan, the Army major psychiatrist who was radicalized in a relationship with Anwar al-Awlaki. So there is a difference there. My cautioning here. And I think we both are friends with Spencer Ackerman has made a lot out of al-Qaeda not what it used to be. Right. Is that if we were having this conversation a year and a half ago, and you said, or I said, al-Qaeda is capable of attacks in the United States, most of the intelligence community say actually that's wrong, and most analysts would say that's wrong, that al-Qaeda had not demonstrated that capability. Now we know they have what appears to have been multiple networks in the United States. We know that Najibullah Zazi had a network in people buying chemicals in Denver, Colorado, as well as New York, the New York City area. We know about the lone gunman attempts like Nadal Hassan and Faisal Shahzad, but a guy named David Headley, who was in contact with one of the senior al-Qaeda commanders, a guy named Ilyas Kashmiri, was a major planner of the Mumbai attacks and was asked to